In 1963, Dr. Margaret Whitfield completed what would become the most controversial dissertation in comparative literature at Cambridge University. Her research, titled Narrative Echoes, the documented origins of 7 European folk tales, would never see publication. The university archived the work indefinitely, citing concerns over the psychological impact of her findings on academic readers. Dr. Whitfield herself disappeared from academic circles entirely, retreating to a small cottage in the Scottish Highlands, where she lived in complete isolation until her death in 1968. What made Dr. Whitfield's research so disturbing was not the fairy tales themselves, but the documented evidence she had uncovered linking each story to actual events. 7 tales, 7 locations across Europe, 7 families whose real suffering had been transformed into children's bedtime stories. The dissertation contained photocopies of court records, church registers, medical documents, and personal correspondence that painted a picture far darker than any printed fairy tale collection. The first case documented in Dr. Whitfield's research concerned the tale known as Little Red Riding Hood. Her investigation led her to the village of Bergheim in the Vosges Mountains of eastern France, where church records from 1746 revealed the disappearance of Marie-Claire Rousseau, aged 18, daughter of the local miller. The girl had been tasked with delivering bread to her grandmother's cottage, located approximately 3 kilometers through dense forest. She never arrived. According to village records preserved in the local parish archives, Marie-Claire's grandmother, Clotilde Rousseau, had been living alone since her husband's death 2 years prior. Neighbors described the elderly woman as increasingly isolated and peculiar, speaking often of wolves that came too close to her cottage. The local priest, Father Dumaine, noted in his personal journal that Clotilde had stopped attending Sunday Mass and had been seen wearing men's clothing while tending her small garden. When Marie-Claire failed to return home by evening, her father organized a search party. They found the girl's red woolen cloak hanging from a tree branch approximately halfway to the grandmother's cottage. The fabric showed signs of tearing, but no blood was discovered. More disturbing was what they found at Clotilde's cottage the following morning. The search party discovered Clotilde Rousseau dead in her bed, apparently from natural causes. However, her appearance shocked the villagers. The elderly woman was dressed in Marie-Claire's clothes, which were far too small for her frame. Her grey hair had been roughly braided with red ribbon, identical to what Marie-Claire typically wore. Most unsettling was the discovery of partially eaten bread loaves scattered throughout the cottage, bread that matched the type Marie-Claire had been carrying. Marie-Claire's body was never found. Father Dumaine's journal entries from the weeks following the incident describe increasingly bizarre reports from villagers. Several claimed to have seen a figure in red moving through the forest at dawn, always disappearing when approached. Others reported finding children's clothing hung in trees along the forest path. The priest himself wrote of hearing what he described as a young woman's voice calling for help during his evening walks, though searches of the area yielded nothing. The village blacksmith, Henri Moreau, provided perhaps the most disturbing account in a letter to his brother dated 2 months after Marie-Claire's disappearance. Moreau claimed to have encountered something that was not quite human while returning from work late one evening. The figure wore a red cloak and approached him on the forest path, asking for directions to grandmother's house. When Moreau raised his lantern to see the person's face, he claimed the features were wrong somehow, as if someone had tried to remember what a young woman looked like, but had gotten the details mixed up. The second documented case took Dr. Whitfield to the village of Hamelin in Lower Saxony, Germany, where the famous Pied Piper legend originated. Her research uncovered records from 1384 that told a far more sinister story than the familiar tale of magical flute music luring rats and children away. According to municipal records preserved in the Hamelin town archives, a man calling himself Johann von Wesel arrived in the town during the summer of 1384. He presented himself as a travelling musician and offered his services to eliminate the severe rat infestation that had been plaguing the community. What the official story omitted was that von Wesel had arrived with 2 associates and had established themselves in an abandoned mill outside the town proper. The town council agreed to von Wesel's proposed fee for rat elimination, but contemporary records suggest there was more to the arrangement. A private letter from Bürger Klaus Henning to his cousin in Bremen mentions additional services that von Wesel's group would provide, specifically related to problematic children in the community. This letter, discovered by Dr. Whitfield in a collection of medieval correspondence, suggests that certain families in Hamelin had arranged for their children to be removed from the town permanently. On the 26th day of June, 1384, approximately 130 children between the ages of 10 and 18 disappeared from Hamelin. Official records state they followed a mysterious piper out of town and were never seen again. However, Dr. Whitfield's investigation uncovered evidence suggesting these children had been specifically selected in advance. A roster found in the basement of what was once the von Wesel Group's mill contained the names of all the missing children, along with notations about their families' financial status and social standing. Many of the disappeared children came from families who owed significant debts to local merchants, or who had been involved in various legal disputes. Others were described in church records as troubled or unruly. Most damaging to the traditional narrative was Dr. Whitfield's discovery of expense records from the town treasury dated 3 months before the children's disappearance, showing payments to J. von Wesel and associates for municipal services. The amounts were far larger than would be expected for simple rat extermination, suggesting the town officials had planned the children's removal well in advance. Several families reported that their children had mentioned strange dreams in the weeks before the disappearance, dreams of beautiful music calling them to follow a particular path out of town. A surviving letter from Anna Brenner to her sister describes how her son, one of the missing children, had been leaving food scraps in specific locations around town for the music man's animals. The letter suggests the children had been conditioned over time to trust and follow von Wesel's instructions. The third case brought Dr. Whitfield to the remote village of Schwarzenberg in the Bavarian forest, where she investigated the origins of the Hansel and Gretel tale. Her research focused on events from 1597, when siblings Caspar and Margarete Zimmermann, aged 19 and 20 respectively, disappeared during a particularly harsh winter. The Zimmermann family had been struggling with severe food shortages, like many families in the region that year. According to church records, Caspar and Margaret's father, Wilhelm Zimmermann, had approached the village elder about options for reducing the burden on his household. Contemporary documents suggest there was an established practice in the area of sending young adults to work as servants for wealthy landowners in exchange for room and board. Dr. Whitfield discovered correspondence between Wilhelm Zimmermann and a woman identified only as Frau Bertha, who lived in an isolated manor house deeper in the forest. The letters, preserved in a collection of family papers held by the regional monastery, detail arrangements for Caspar and Margaret to work as servants during the winter months. Frau Bertha's responses, written in an educated hand, promised good food and warm quarters in exchange for household labor. When spring arrived and the siblings had not returned, Wilhelm Zimmermann traveled to the manor house to inquire about his children. He found the building burned to its foundation, with no signs of recent habitation. Local records indicate that Frau Bertha's true identity was Helena von Rauschenberg, a widow who had inherited the property from her deceased husband but had been living in severe poverty for several years. Investigation of the burned manor revealed disturbing details. Among the ashes, searchers found fragments of multiple sets of clothing that appeared to belong to young adults, far more than could be accounted for by just 2 servants. They also discovered the remains of an elaborate kitchen facility that seemed designed for preparing large quantities of food, though the building showed signs of long-term decay and abandonment. Most unsettling was the discovery of Helena von Rauschenberg's body in the basement of the ruined manor. The remains suggested she had died of starvation, possibly months before the building burned. This raised questions about who had been corresponding with Wilhelm Zimmermann and who had received his children at the manor house. A journal found among Helena's possessions, partially damaged by fire, contained entries describing visits from hungry young ones who came seeking work during harsh winters. The handwriting deteriorated significantly in the final entries, and the content became increasingly incoherent, suggesting Helena had been suffering from severe malnutrition and possibly mental deterioration during her final months. The 4th case documented by Dr. Whitfield centered on the village of Villeneuve-sur-Yonne in Burgundy, France, where she investigated the real events behind the Sleeping Beauty tale. Her research focused on the disappearance of Isabelle de Montclair, an 18-year-old daughter of minor nobility in 1612. According to records maintained by the local abbey, Isabelle had been suffering from what contemporary medical documents described as episodes of prolonged sleep since childhood. Modern analysis of the symptoms described suggests she may have suffered from a neurological condition causing periods of unconsciousness lasting several days. The family had consulted various physicians and even brought in specialists from Paris, but no effective treatment had been found. The de Montclair family lived in a modest chateau on the outskirts of Villeneuve-sur-Yonne. Financial records show the family had been struggling with mounting debts, largely due to medical expenses related to Isabelle's condition. By 1612, they were facing the possible loss of their property unless significant funds could be obtained quickly. Dr. Whitfield discovered a series of letters between Comte Philippe de Montclair and various wealthy suitors from neighboring provinces. The correspondence reveals a desperate father attempting to arrange a marriage for his daughter, despite her medical condition. One potential suitor, Baron Antoine de Roche, expressed particular interest in Isabelle's situation, describing it as a most intriguing challenge in his letters. On the 15th of September 1612, Isabelle fell into one of her prolonged sleep episodes. This time, however, the family made an unusual decision. Instead of waiting for her to naturally awaken, they announced her death and staged an elaborate funeral ceremony. Burial records from the local church confirmed that a funeral was held and that a coffin was interred in the family crypt. What actually happened to Isabelle during this period remained unclear until Dr. Whitfield discovered correspondence between Comte de Montclair and Baron de Roche, dated several months after the supposed funeral. The letters reveal that Isabelle had been secretly transported to Baron de Roche's estate while unconscious, where physicians in his employ were attempting experimental treatments for her condition. The Baron's own physician, Dr. Claude Montpellier, kept detailed records of these treatments, which Dr. Whitfield found in the archives of the Regional Medical College. The treatments were barbaric by any standard, involving various chemical compounds intended to either maintain or break Isabelle's unconscious states. Dr. Montpellier's notes suggest the Baron was fascinated by the idea of having complete control over another person's consciousness. Isabelle's fate was revealed in a confession letter written by Dr. Montpellier years later. The physician admitted that the experimental treatments had ultimately proven fatal, and that Isabelle had died while unconscious in the Baron's chateau. Her body had been disposed of secretly to avoid scandal. The letter also revealed that several other young women with similar conditions had been brought to the Baron's estate for similar experiments, none of whom had survived. The fifth investigation took Dr. Whitfield to the village of Millhaven in Yorkshire, England, where she researched the true events behind the Cinderella story. Her focus was on the household of merchant Thomas Ashworth and events that occurred in 1634, involving his stepdaughter Sarah Hartwell. Sarah's mother, Margaret Hartwell, had died when Sarah was 16, leaving the girl in the care of her stepfather and his two daughters from a previous marriage. According to probate records, Margaret had left a small inheritance specifically for Sarah, but the funds were to be managed by Thomas Ashworth until Sarah reached the age of 21, or married. Dr. Whitfield discovered that Thomas Ashworth had been facing significant financial difficulties following several failed business ventures. Rather than preserving Sarah's inheritance, he had used the money to settle his debts, leaving Sarah with no resources of her own. The household servants, in testimony given years later during legal proceedings, described Sarah as being treated essentially as unpaid domestic help rather than as a family member. The situation became more complex when Sarah reached 18 and began attracting the attention of eligible young men in the community. Court records reveal that Thomas Ashworth actively discouraged these relationships, likely because Sarah's marriage would trigger questions about her inheritance and potentially expose his financial mismanagement. The pivotal events occurred during the Autumn Harvest Festival of 1634. A wealthy landowner, Sir Edmund Fairfax, had organized an elaborate celebration at his estate, and Sarah had somehow acquired appropriate clothing to attend. Contemporary accounts describe her transformation as remarkable, suggesting she had received assistance from sources unknown to her step-family. What Dr. Whitfield discovered through careful examination of estate records was that Sarah had been secretly meeting with Sir Edmund's elderly housekeeper, Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, who had known Sarah's late mother. Mrs. Whitmore had provided Sarah with clothing, jewelry, and coaching on proper social behavior, all in preparation for the harvest celebration. The plan was for Sarah to attract Sir Edmund's attention during the celebration, leading to a marriage proposal that would remove her from the Ashworth household and potentially expose Thomas's financial crimes. The strategy proved successful, but with tragic consequences that the fairy tale omits. Thomas Ashworth, realizing that Sarah's marriage would lead to his financial ruin and possible imprisonment, took desperate action. On the night of the harvest celebration, while Sarah was at the Fairfax estate, Thomas arranged for the family home to catch fire. The blaze destroyed all records of Sarah's inheritance and killed both of his own daughters, who were asleep in the house. When Sarah returned home in the early morning hours, she found her step-family dead and the house in ruins. Thomas Ashworth's body was found in his study, apparently overcome by smoke while attempting to save important documents. The official investigation concluded that the fire was accidental, caused by an unattended hearth, but Mrs. Whitmore's testimony, recorded years later, suggests Sarah suspected her stepfather had deliberately set the fire to destroy evidence of his theft. Sarah did marry Sir Edmund Fairfax several months after the tragedy, but their marriage was reportedly troubled. Estate records indicate that Sarah suffered from what would now be recognized as severe trauma, experiencing frequent nightmares and periods of overwhelming anxiety. She died at age 23 during childbirth, leaving behind an infant son who would inherit the Fairfax estate. The sixth case brought Dr. Whitfield to the coastal village of Ravenshollow in Cornwall, England, where she investigated the origins of the Little Mermaid tale through events that occurred in 1729. Her research centered on the disappearance of Marina Blackwater, the 18-year-old daughter of a local fisherman. Marina had been born with a condition that severely affected her lower limbs, making walking extremely difficult and painful. Despite this disability, she was known for her exceptional swimming ability and spent much of her time in the tidal pools and coastal waters near Ravens Hollow. The villagers, many of whom were deeply superstitious, viewed Marina's affinity for water with a mixture of admiration and unease. Dr. Whitfield discovered that Marina had become infatuated with a young man named Jonathan Seymour, the son of a wealthy merchant from London who had come to Ravens Hollow to oversee his family's shipping interests. Jonathan was engaged to be married to a woman of his own social class, but he had developed what contemporary letters describe as an inappropriate fascination with Marina. The relationship between Marina and Jonathan was documented in a series of letters found in the attic of the former Seymour shipping office. The correspondence reveals a troubled young man who saw Marina as an exotic curiosity rather than a potential romantic partner. His letters to friends in London describe her as more creature of the sea than human woman, and detail his plans to study her unique nature before returning to his proper life in the city. Marina's own letters, written to Jonathan but apparently never sent, were discovered hidden in a sea cave where she was known to spend time alone. These letters reveal a young woman desperately in love and willing to do anything to become worthy of Jonathan's attention. Most disturbing was her detailed description of seeking help from the old woman who knows the ancient ways, referring to Prudence Grimm, an elderly widow who lived in isolation on the moors above Ravens Hollow. Local records indicate that Prudence Grimm was widely suspected of practicing folk medicine and possibly darker arts. Several villagers had consulted her for various ailments over the years, with mixed and sometimes dangerous results. Dr. Whitfield found evidence that Marina had been visiting Prudence regularly in the weeks before her disappearance. On the night of August 31st, 1729, Marina was seen walking toward the cliffs above Ravens Hollow, moving without her usual difficulty. Several witnesses reported that she appeared to be in severe pain, but was determined to continue toward the sea. Her body was found 3 days later, washed up on a remote beach several miles along the coast. The coroner's examination revealed disturbing details about Marina's condition at the time of death. Her lower limbs showed signs of severe chemical burns, suggesting she had applied some form of caustic substance to her legs in an attempt to transform herself. Prudence Grimm, when questioned by local authorities, claimed Marina had stolen certain herbs and compounds from her dwelling without understanding their proper use. Jonathan Seymour left Ravens Hollow immediately upon learning of Marina's death and never returned to Cornwall. His final letter to the family's business partners, preserved in shipping company records, expressed his shock at what he termed the primitive and dangerous superstitions of the local population. He made no mention of his relationship with Marina, but the letter suggests he felt some responsibility for her tragic end. The seventh and final case documented by Dr. Whitfield took her to the village of Rosenhof in the Black Forest region of Baden-Württemberg, Germany. Here she investigated the real events behind the snow-white tale, focusing on the household of Baron Klaus von Rosenhof and events that occurred in 1589. The Baron's young wife, Lady Adelheid von Rosenhof, had died giving birth to her daughter, Margaret, in 1571. Baron von Rosenhof remarried 3 years later to Lady Brunhilde von Schwarzburg, a widow known for her intelligence and ambition. Contemporary records describe Lady Brunhilde as an exceptionally educated woman for her time, with interests in alchemy, medicine, and natural philosophy. Dr. Whitfield's research revealed that Lady Brunhilde had established what amounted to a private laboratory in the basement of the Rosenhof Castle, where she conducted experiments with various chemical compounds and botanical preparations. Correspondence with scholars in Prague and Vienna shows that she was attempting to develop new medical treatments and cosmetic preparations, work that was unusual and potentially dangerous for a woman of her era. As Margaret grew older, tensions developed between stepmother and stepdaughter. Court records from later legal proceedings reveal that Margaret had begun questioning Lady Brunhild's activities, particularly after several household servants became ill following consumption of Lady Brunhild's experimental preparations. Margaret, who had reached 18 by 1589, was approaching the age when she would inherit her mother's considerable dowry and potentially challenge her stepmother's authority over the household. The situation reached a crisis point in the autumn of 1589 when Margaret discovered evidence that Lady Brunhilde had been slowly poisoning Baron von Rosenhoff with small doses of mercury and other toxic substances. Margaret's accusations led to a violent confrontation between the two women, witnessed by several servants whose testimony was later recorded during legal proceedings. Rather than face exposure and potential execution for attempted murder, Lady Brunhilde fled the castle during the night of October 13th, 1589. She took with her a significant amount of valuable jewelry and gold, as well as her entire collection of alchemical materials and notes. Margaret was found unconscious in her bedchamber the following morning, apparently poisoned, but still alive. Dr. Whitfield discovered that Margaret had been transported to a remote monastery in the mountains, where the monks attempted to treat her condition using traditional remedies and prayer. The young woman remained in a coma-like state for several weeks before gradually recovering. However, the poisoning had left her with permanent neurological damage, affecting her memory and cognitive abilities. Baron von Rosenhoff, who had also been slowly recovering from his wife's poisoning attempts, eventually arranged for Margaret to live quietly at the monastery under the care of the monks. Official records indicate that Margaret von Rosenhoff died in 1593, but Dr. Whitfield found evidence suggesting this death was fabricated to protect the young woman from potential revenge by Lady Brunhild or her associates. A letter from the monastery's abbot to the regional bishop, dated 1602, refers to the young woman who lives among us under another name and requests continued financial support for her care. The letter suggests that Margaret had lived under the protection of the monks for many years, possibly until her natural death much later in life. Lady Brunhilde von Schwarzburg was never captured or brought to justice for her crimes. Reports of a woman matching her description appeared in various German cities over the following years, always associated with mysterious illnesses or deaths among wealthy households where she had gained employment as a companion or housekeeper. Dr. Whitfield's final chapter examined the process by which these real events had been transformed into fairy tales. Her research suggested that the stories served multiple purposes beyond simple entertainment. They provided a way for communities to process and discuss traumatic events without directly confronting the terrible realities of what had actually occurred. By transforming real victims into fictional characters and adding magical elements, the stories allowed people to explore themes of danger, survival, and justice, while maintaining psychological distance from the original tragedies. More disturbing was Dr. Whitfield's conclusion that many of the perpetrators in these cases had deliberately encouraged the spread of fictional versions of events. By allowing their crimes to be mythologized and magical elements to be added, they could ensure that any future accusations would be dismissed as mere folklore. The fairy tales, in effect, served as the perfect cover for historical atrocities. Dr. Whitfield's final notes, discovered among her personal papers after her death, revealed that she had received threatening letters during the course of her research. Someone, apparently connected to the families involved in these historical cases, had been monitoring her work and demanding that she cease her investigations. The letters, written in multiple languages but sharing certain distinctive characteristics, suggested that descendants of the original perpetrators were still alive and still invested in maintaining the fictional versions of these events. Her last journal entry, dated 3 days before her disappearance from academic life, simply read, "They are still watching. The stories must continue to be just stories. I understand now why some truths are better left buried. The university's decision to suppress Dr. Whitfield's dissertation may have been influenced by factors beyond academic concern. Several members of the review committee had family connections to European nobility, including some with historical ties to the regions Dr. Whitfield had investigated. The possibility that powerful families might still be protecting centuries-old secrets added another layer of complexity to an already disturbing body of research. In 1965, a fire at the Cambridge University archives destroyed several boxes of medieval documents that Dr. Whitfield had requested for her research. The fire was attributed to an electrical fault, but it conveniently eliminated many of the primary sources that had supported her most controversial findings. Contemporary newspaper reports noted that the fire had been unusually localized, affecting only specific collections while leaving adjacent materials completely untouched. Dr. Whitfield's cottage in the Scottish Highlands was found empty in 1968, with no signs of struggle, but also no indication of where she might have gone. Her personal research materials had been removed, and her neighbors reported seeing unfamiliar vehicles in the area during the weeks before her disappearance. Local police treated the case as a missing person investigation, but no evidence of foul play was ever established. The fairy tales themselves continued to be published and retold, with new versions appearing regularly that further obscured any connections to historical events. Publishers seemed particularly interested in emphasizing the magical elements while minimizing any realistic details that might prompt readers to consider whether the stories had factual origins. Children continued to read about talking wolves, magical pumpkins, and evil witches, never suspecting that these fantastical elements might be concealing much darker human truths. In 1967, a young graduate student at Oxford University attempted to continue Dr. Whitfield's research, focusing specifically on the Hansel and Gretel case. Timothy Morrison had obtained copies of some of Dr. Whitfield's preliminary notes through unofficial channels and was attempting to verify her findings through independent investigation. His research was cut short when he suffered what medical authorities described as a complete mental breakdown, requiring hospitalization and eventually leading to his withdrawal from academic life entirely. Morrison's roommate later reported that Timothy had been receiving strange phone calls in the weeks before his breakdown, calls that left him increasingly agitated and paranoid. The young man had apparently become convinced that someone was following him and had started sleeping with furniture barricaded against his dormitory room door. His final coherent statement to medical staff was a warning that the stories are still protecting them, and that continuing the research would be dangerous for anyone involved. The 7 fairy tales documented in Dr. Whitfield's research continued to evolve throughout the 20th century, with each new adaptation moving further away from any resemblance to historical fact. Disney's animated versions, while commercially successful, bore almost no relationship to the traditional European folk tales, let alone the documented historical events that had inspired them. The process of cultural sanitization appeared to be accelerating, as if there were deliberate efforts to ensure that each generation of children would be further removed from any possibility of connecting these stories to real events. Contemporary folklore scholars occasionally noted unusual patterns in the development of these particular tales, observing that they seem to resist certain types of academic analysis. Research grants for historical investigation of fairy tale origins were frequently denied or cancelled, and academic papers exploring the realistic elements in traditional stories were often rejected by journals without clear explanation. The scholarly community appeared to have developed an unspoken understanding that certain topics were better left unexplored. Dr. Whitfield's work might have remained completely lost to history if not for a single copy of her dissertation that surfaced in 1969. A demolition crew working on an old building in Cambridge discovered a metal box hidden within a wall cavity, containing Dr. Whitfield's complete research, along with photocopies of all her supporting documents. The construction workers, recognizing the potential value of the academic materials, brought them to the attention of university officials. Rather than celebrating the recovery of important historical research, the university's response was swift and decisive. The materials were immediately classified as potentially dangerous to public safety and placed under strict access restrictions. Official statements cited concerns about the psychological impact of the content on readers, but internal memos suggested that pressure from unnamed external sources had influenced the decision to suppress the work once again. The box had also contained a letter from Dr. Whitfield, apparently written shortly before her disappearance, explaining her decision to hide copies of her research. She had correctly anticipated that attempts would be made to destroy her work entirely, and she wanted to ensure that future researchers might have access to the truth she had uncovered. Her letter ended with a warning that the fairy tales were not innocent entertainment, but rather carefully constructed barriers protecting terrible secrets that some people will kill to preserve. A single academic, Professor Elizabeth Hartwell of Edinburgh University, managed to examine Dr. Whitfield's materials briefly before they were sealed away. Her written assessment, completed in 72 hours before access was revoked, confirmed the thoroughness and credibility of Dr. Whitfield's research. Professor Hartwell noted that the documentation was extensive and appeared authentic, representing the most comprehensive investigation of fairy tale origins ever undertaken. Professor Hartwell's own attempt to publish her assessment was blocked when her university received legal threats from solicitors representing several prominent European families. The lawyers claimed that Dr. Whitfield's research contained slanderous allegations about their clients' ancestors and demanded that all related materials be destroyed. While the legal threats had no actual merit, given the historical nature of the allegations, the university chose to avoid confrontation by agreeing to suppress Professor Hartwell's work. The pattern of suppression continued throughout the 1970s, as any scholar who attempted to investigate fairy tale origins in depth encountered unusual obstacles. Research funding disappeared, academic positions were terminated, and in some cases, researchers simply abandoned their work without explanation. The message became clear within academic circles: certain topics were off-limits, and those who ignored the warnings did so at their own peril. By 1980, the fairy tales had become so deeply embedded in popular culture that questioning their innocent nature seemed almost absurd. New generations of children grew up with sanitized versions of the stories, completely disconnected from any awareness that these might be more than simple fantasy tales. The original purpose of the stories, to preserve community memory of traumatic events, had been completely subverted, turning them into instruments for concealing rather than revealing truth. The commercialization of fairy tales in the late 20th century provided another layer of protection for the secrets they contained. Copyright laws and trademark protections meant that any attempt to publish research connecting the stories to historical events could be met with immediate legal challenges from entertainment companies. The stories had become valuable intellectual property, and anything that might damage their commercial appeal was aggressively suppressed through legal channels. In 1995, a documentary filmmaker attempted to create a program about Dr. Whitfield's research based on fragmentary information that had leaked from academic sources over the years. The project was abandoned when the filmmaker received explicit threats against her family's safety. Production notes found among her papers after her death in 2003 indicated that she had been approached by representatives of the same families whose ancestors Dr. Whitfield had investigated, and that these individuals had made it clear that continued work on the project would have serious consequences. The final attempt to bring Dr. Whitfield's research to public attention occurred in 1998, when a former Cambridge librarian published a memoir describing his years working with restricted academic collections. The book contained a brief chapter about Dr. Whitfield's dissertation, including several quotes from her work and a general description of her findings. The publisher withdrew the book from sale within days of its release, citing factual concerns, and the librarian himself disappeared shortly afterward. Today, the 7 fairy tales continue to be among the most popular children's stories in the world. New adaptations appear regularly in print, film, and digital media, each generation of creators adding new layers of fantasy while remaining completely unaware of the historical tragedies that inspired the original tales. The stories have achieved their ultimate purpose as instruments of concealment, transforming real suffering into entertainment while protecting the reputations of families whose ancestors committed terrible crimes. Dr. Whitfield's research remains hidden in university archives, accessible only to a handful of scholars who must sign extensive confidentiality agreements before being allowed to examine the materials. Those who have seen her work describe it as compelling but deeply disturbing, noting that her evidence appears to be thorough and credible despite the extraordinary nature of her claims. The consensus among the few academics who have studied her findings is that some truths are too dangerous to be widely known. The descendants of the perpetrators Dr. Whitfield identified continue to live comfortable lives throughout Europe, protected by centuries of accumulated wealth and social position. Their family histories contain no mention of the crimes their ancestors committed, and the fairy tales that once served as community memory of those crimes now function as perfect smokescreens, ensuring that the truth remains buried beneath layers of fantasy and commercialization. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of Dr. Whitfield's research was her conclusion that the transformation of historical atrocities into children's entertainment represents a particularly sophisticated form of cultural manipulation. By encouraging societies to think of these stories as harmless fantasy, the guilty families ensured that their crimes would not only be forgotten, but would actually be celebrated as creative achievements. The very popularity of the fairy tales serves as proof of how completely the truth has been obscured. The 7 locations where these original crimes occurred have all experienced unusual patterns of tragedy and misfortune over the centuries since Dr. Whitfield's investigation. Local historical societies in these areas report difficulty maintaining accurate records, with documents frequently disappearing from archives or being damaged in mysterious accidents. Researchers who attempt to investigate the historical backgrounds of these communities often abandon their work abruptly, citing personal reasons or unexpected career opportunities elsewhere. Modern forensic techniques could potentially verify some of Dr. Whitfield's findings, particularly regarding the human remains that were discovered during her research. However, access to these historical sites for archaeological investigation has been consistently denied by current property owners, many of whom trace their ownership back to the original families involved in the crimes. Legal challenges to these restrictions have been unsuccessful, with courts generally ruling that private property rights supersede academic research interests. The few copies of Dr. Whitfield's work that escaped destruction remain among the most restricted documents in European academic collections. Students and researchers who request access to these materials are subjected to extensive background checks and psychological evaluations, ostensibly to ensure they can handle the disturbing content responsibly. In practice, these requirements serve as effective barriers that prevent serious investigation of Dr. Whitfield's claims while maintaining the appearance of academic openness. The transformation of historical atrocity into popular entertainment continues to accelerate in the digital age. Social media platforms amplify sanitized versions of fairy tales, while algorithms actively suppress content that questions their origins or suggests darker interpretations. The stories have achieved a level of cultural protection that exceeds even that enjoyed by established religions, with any attempt to examine their historical foundations treated as both academic heresy and commercial threat. Dr. Whitfield's final warning, discovered among her hidden papers, proves increasingly relevant with each passing year. When societies choose comfortable lies over difficult truths, they create the conditions for history's worst crimes to be repeated. These stories were meant to help communities remember and learn from tragedy. By transforming them into entertainment, we have ensured that the lessons they contained are lost forever, leaving us vulnerable to the same evils that created them. The 7 fairy tales remain popular bedtime stories for millions of children worldwide, their true origins buried beneath centuries of careful manipulation and cultural amnesia. Parents continue to read these tales to their children, never suspecting that they are perpetuating the very system that allowed historical monsters to escape justice and their descendants to live in comfort built on the suffering of forgotten victims. The stories that were once warnings have become lullabies, and the truth they contained has been transformed into the very weapon used to conceal it. In the end, Dr. Whitfield's research serves as a reminder that history is written by those with the power to control the narrative. The fairy tales represent perhaps the most successful example of historical revision ever achieved, transforming documented atrocities into beloved cultural treasures, while ensuring that the guilty families remain protected by the very stories that should have preserved memory of their crimes. The magic in these tales is not supernatural, but rather represents the very human ability to make uncomfortable truths disappear through repetition of more palatable lies. The files remain sealed, the stories remain popular, and the truth remains hidden. Dr. Whitfield's sacrifice achieved nothing except to add one more disappeared academic to the long list of people who learn too much about things that powerful families prefer to keep secret. The fairy tales continue their work of concealment, proving that sometimes the most effective way to hide a crime is to turn it into a children's story. The silence that followed Dr. Whitfield's disappearance extended far beyond academic circles. In 1969, the last known copy of her research vanished from a secure vault at Cambridge University during what officials described as a routine transfer of materials. Security cameras malfunctioned during the precise hours when the theft occurred, and no investigation ever identified the perpetrators. By 1970, the fairy tales had achieved something unprecedented in literary history: complete immunity from serious academic scrutiny. University literature departments quietly removed courses that examined the historical origins of folk tales, replacing them with programs focused exclusively on narrative structure and cultural symbolism. Students were actively discouraged from pursuing research that might connect fictional stories to documented historical events. The commercial success of sanitized fairy tale adaptations provided the final layer of protection. Entertainment corporations invested billions of dollars in properties based on these stories, creating powerful economic incentives to maintain their innocent reputation. Legal teams stood ready to challenge any publication or documentary that might suggest darker origins for these valuable intellectual properties. In 2007, a construction project in the Scottish Highlands uncovered the ruins of what appeared to be Dr. Whitfield's cottage. Among the debris Workers found fragments of burned documents and a single page from her research notes. The page contained only a partial list of names, descendants of the original perpetrators who were allegedly still monitoring anyone who showed interest in the true history of these tales. The construction company reported the discovery to local authorities, but the materials disappeared from evidence storage within 48 hours. The official explanation cited procedural errors in documentation, but the construction crew supervisor later admitted privately that well-dressed strangers had visited the site multiple times before the formal report was filed. Today, children around the world continue to fall asleep to stories of brave princesses, clever woodsmen, and magical transformations. Parents read these tales with warm feelings of nostalgia, remembering their own childhood experiences with the same stories. The cycle of comfortable deception continues, ensuring that each new generation remains as far removed from the truth as possible. The 7 families whose ancestors committed these historical atrocities have successfully transformed their crimes into beloved cultural institutions. Their descendants live in comfort, protected by the very stories that should serve as monuments to their families' victims. The fairy tales have become the perfect crime. Not only were the original perpetrators never punished, but their crimes have been transformed into sources of joy and profit for their heirs. Dr. Whitfield's research remains the only comprehensive documentation of how historical atrocities can be successfully disguised as entertainment. Her work stands as a warning about the dangers of allowing comfortable fiction to replace uncomfortable fact, and about the price societies pay when they choose pleasant myths over difficult truths. The fairy tales continue their work of concealment, proving that sometimes the most effective way to bury the past is to turn it into a bedtime story. In the end, magic proved to be real after all. The magic of making entire societies forget that monsters were once human, and that the most dangerous fairy tales are the ones we tell ourselves about the innocence of our cultural traditions. The 7 haunted fairy tales remain exactly what Dr. Whitfield discovered them to be: carefully constructed monuments to historical amnesia, ensuring that the crimes they commemorate will never be remembered, never be mourned, and never be prevented from happening again. And perhaps, in that silence between the last word of each story and the child's sleepy goodnight, the real victims find their only memorial. A moment of quiet darkness that holds the truth no one is allowed to speak.